World War II technically kicked off in 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. But if we're being honest, the fire had been building long before that. The world was still licking its wounds from World War I, the supposed war to end all wars, which obviously didn't work out that way. Countries were broke, angry, and suspicious of each other. The Treaty of Versailles had humiliated Germany, and the rise of dictators like Hitler, Mussolini, and Japan's militarist leaders pushed nations back towards the AIDS. Add in a global depression, unstable borders, and a whole lot of unresolved tension, and you got a planet gearing up for another massive fight. Tier 1. The stuff you know, but it's still awful. The final solution, 1933. When most people think of World War II, they picture the popular stories, the ones Hollywood loves. You know, tanks rolling through muddy fields, soldiers lighting cigarettes after battle, planes flying over Europe in perfect formation, that type of stuff. But even the familiar tales have teeth, starting with the final solution. For years before the war even kicked off, Hitler and the Nazis were already planting the seeds of genocide. They blamed Jewish people for everything, losing World War I, the economy tanking, even the so-called collapse of traditional values. Repeat the lie enough times, and eventually, the crowd starts to cheer. When Hitler became chancellor in 1933, the hate slowly turned into anti-Jewish laws. They smeared swastikas on shops, carried out humiliating public beatings, and torched synagogues. Then came the ghettos, where people starved behind walls and had to eat garbage to survive. But that was just a warm-up. By 1941, Nazi leadership, under Hitler's directives, gave the green light for full-blown genocide. The SS and their helpers shot Jews by the thousands in forests after forcing them to dig their own graves. Some victims were lined up and shot into mass graves, sometimes still breathing when the next body landed. Others were crammed into gas vans, choking on carbon monoxide as German soldiers stood outside, waiting for the banging on the walls to stop. The genocide was cold and systematic, but it wasn't efficient enough, so they built death factories in Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor, places where trains arrived packed with human cargo, and within hours most were dead. The victims were stripped and shaved. Children, elders, and entire families vanished into gas chambers disguised as showers. Zyklon B did the job in minutes. Screams, banging, desperation, and then silence. Even in death, the captives suffered horrible indignities. Their bodies were burned in crematoria or tossed into pits. The Nazis kept records, photos, jewelry, and even the hair of their victims. They also held on to things like gold teeth pulled from their victims' corpses, as if they were some kind of trophy. By the time the war ended, 6 million Jews were gone, along with millions of Roma, disabled people, Poles, and Soviet POWs, not killed in battle, erased, their homes looted, their graves unmarked, their names left only in lists. The Nanjing Massacre. Before Auschwitz and Hiroshima became the defining horrors of World War II, the streets of Nanjing ran red. Across the Pacific, Japanese soldiers committed horrors that could rival anything that happened in Europe. The 1937 Nanjing Massacre was horrifyingly violent, and that's putting it mildly. The Japanese Empire saw itself as racially superior and used that belief to justify war crimes across Asia. When Japanese forces stormed the Chinese capital in December 1937, they went beyond trying to win a war and did horrible things that blurred the line between soldier and sadist. The invasion followed months of slaughter as the Japanese advanced from Shanghai. In this time, the countryside between the two cities turned into a graveyard. Japanese soldiers burned villages, shot civilians for sport, and tortured women with such cruelty that it's hard to talk about without your stomach turning. By the time they reached Nanjing, the soldiers were already well versed in monstrous butchery. But the capital was where things really went off the rails. Once the city fell, the Japanese army went completely feral. The order was simple: kill all captives. And they didn't just follow it, they enjoyed it. The soldiers murdered tens of thousands of POWs and random men on the streets, rounding them up like cattle and opening fire without hesitation. Not even teenagers or the elderly were safe. And the women, including little girls, weren't spared either. rape became a weapon of war, and it didn't matter to the men that some of the victims were babies. The survivors, if you can even call them that, were often killed right after, in ways so grotesque they would have you questioning your faith in humanity. One of the most infamous events was the so-called killing contest between two Japanese officers. The rules: first to 100 kills with a sword wins. Simple, horrifying, and treated like a game. Newspapers in the area covered it like it was a baseball game, even putting together a makeshift score sheet. By the time it was over, one guy had racked up 105 kills, the other 106, but they never officially declared a winner. The Blitz, 1940. Back in the West, Churchill was giving his trademark fire up the nation speeches while Londoners slept in subways, hiding from German bombs. The first bombs dropped on a Saturday night. At first, most people figured it was just another false alarm, until the sirens started going off. The planes started humming, and the sky lit up like the end of days. London had just barely made it through the Battle of Britain, and was now about to get something even worse: an 8-month-long firestorm campaign known as the Blitz. When the Luftwaffe locked in on the capital, they came with fuel, fire, and a plan to shatter the nation's spirit. From September 1940 to May 1941, London got hit almost every night. Streets disappeared, and buildings that had been standing since Shakespeare's time were reduced to bricks and ash. Families hid in basements and underground stations, praying the next hit wouldn't take them with it. The noise never let up. The fires were basically impossible to put out, and there were so many bodies that funerals had to wait. Some were buried under rubble. Others were abandoned in makeshift morgues. On one especially rough night in December 1940, the city basically caught fire. Bombs hit all over central London, kicking off the Second Great Fire. St. Paul's Cathedral was surrounded by flames, and the blaze was so big it could be seen from miles away. To make matters worse, London wasn't the only one getting roasted. Coventry got leveled, and Liverpool's docks were hit so often they might as well have come pre-labeled with bullseyes. Even sleepy little Hull got bombed so frequently, it became the Luftwaffe's go-to backup target. Eventually, precision bombing turned into let's just drop things and hope for the best. Hospitals, churches, homes, nothing was off limits. But here's the twist: it didn't break the British spirit. The Nazis figured people would panic and fold. Instead, it had the opposite effect. War production kept going, factories moved, and the British, running on spite, and sheer stubbornness, started rebuilding before the smoke even cleared. The Battle of Stalingrad. By the early 40s, Hitler and the Nazis were cocky, convinced the Soviet Union was already beaten. After blitzing through Poland, smashing France, and humiliating Britain at Dunkirk, the Nazis believed they were unstoppable. In 1941, Hitler broke his pact with Stalin and launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. Over 3 million Axis troops stormed into the Soviet Union, expecting a quick victory. Instead, they ran into endless mud, ice, and resistance. By the summer of 1942, Germany was still pushing east, and Hitler shifted his obsession to a symbolic Soviet city, bearing Stalin's name, Stalingrad. It wasn't just about strategy anymore. This was a deadly pissing contest. In response, Stalin issued Order Number 207, not a step back. The Soviet army was to defend the city to the death. At Stalingrad, Soviet soldiers froze in rubble while German troops were slowly starved, shot, or shattered by artillery. Whole city blocks were reduced to smoking cinders. The Luftwaffe rained over 1,000 tons of explosives in a single day, turning the city into a giant furnace. Some estimates say 40,000 civilians were wiped out in those first days alone. Others pushed the numbers closer to 70,000. And still, the Soviets refused to let the city go. German tanks rumbled through the ruins, but every meter they gained, they paid for in blood. Stalin even banned civilians from evacuating, gambling that their presence would raise the stakes. And it worked. The defenders fought from trenches carved into city rubble, from factory floors covered with grease and blood, and from buildings so riddled with bullets they barely stood upright. One Soviet platoon packed themselves into a single apartment block and fought from there for 60 days straight. According to some accounts, they killed more Germans from that one building than the Nazis lost, taking all of Paris. Still, Hitler refused to let his troops pull out. The German Sixth Army got surrounded in November, and the trap slammed shut, freezing, starving, and running out of ammo. German soldiers huddled in cellars eating horsemeat and snow. The Luftwaffe tried to supply them from the air, but it was too little too late. The Soviets didn't break. In the end, they were the ones surrounding the invaders. The proud Sixth Army, once one of Hitler's most elite, surrendered in February. By this point, Stalingrad had become a frozen hell where nearly 2 million people were killed, wounded, or captured. The forced suicide of Erwin Rommel. Erwin Rommel was a German war general who had already made a name for himself in World War I. In fact, he earned his country's top military honor, the Pour le Mérite, which is basically the congrats, you're terrifyingly good at war badge. But it was in North Africa during WWII that Rommel really cemented his legacy. That's where he earned his nickname, the Desert Fox. Rommel was known for playing war clean, at least by the messed up standards of the time. His British enemies actually respected him, and some even said the North African campaign felt like a war without hate. But let's not get too carried away. The Nazis still committed atrocities in that region, including targeting Jewish communities. And whether Rommel looked the other way or just didn't know is still up for debate. What we do know is that he was no fanboy of the SS and kept his distance from a lot of the Reich's darker schemes. But don't mistake distance for innocence. He wasn't some rebel saint. He liked Hitler well enough in the early years, and his rise to Field Marshal wasn't an accident. Fast forward to 1944. A group of officers, fed up with Hitler's suicidal leadership, decided it was time to send the Führer to the afterlife. Rommel wasn't exactly in on the plot, but he knew about it. The Nazi top brass caught wind and decided he had to go, and Hitler, ever the drama queen, didn't want to publicly execute Germany's golden boy. It would risk crushing morale. So instead, he sent 2 generals to Rommel's house with a briefcase full of cyanide and 2 options. Option 1, go to trial, get executed, and drag your whole family down with you. Option 2, take the pill, die quietly, go out as a hero, and your family gets to keep the house, the honor, and the pension. Rommel got into the car, took the pill, and died by the side of a road. Hitler threw a grand funeral and told the world he died from wounds sustained in an earlier airstrike. But after the war, Allied intelligence interviewed Rommel's widow and son, and the real story of his forced suicide came out. The atomic bombings. By 1945, Japan was hanging by a thread, and its cities were being erased from the map in massive firebomb raids. And when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, the US dropped a new kind of weapon that redefined destruction itself. The Americans had been cooking up something in secret. Deep in the desert with enough funding to rival a small nation, the US quietly built a weapon the world had never seen, the atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay flew over Hiroshima and dropped a little metal contraption with a cruelly ironic name, Little Boy. A few seconds later, the sky lit up like a second sun, and in a matter of seconds, Hiroshima's center was obliterated. Buildings crumbled, glass melted, and an estimated 90,000 people were gone. Just like that, people were incinerated instantly. Some left only as shadows on walls, others were disfigured beyond recognition, their bodies blackened, bloated, or burned alive where they stood. And somehow, that still wasn't the end. 3 days later, another B-29 showed up, this time headed for Nagasaki. The bomb on board was named Fat Man, and it packed an even bigger punch. When it dropped, the city didn't stand a chance. Fire, radiation, and utter chaos swallowed almost everything in seconds. Between the 2 bombings, over 200,000 people died, some in seconds, others over agonizing weeks from radiation, infection, and internal collapse. 6 days later, Japan surrendered. Tier 2, the deeper, darker stuff. The Shah's medical experiments. Dachau. opened in 1933 to imprison political enemies like communists and social democrats. But like everything the Nazis touched, it quickly became a nightmare factory by the time it was liberated in 1945. Over 32,000 people had died there, and those are just the ones who made the paperwork. We already covered the final solution. So what else could there possibly be? Well, for one, medical experiment. Prisoners were pulled from their bunks and marched into clinics where men in lab coats acted more like executioners than doctors. They were stripped naked and dunked in vats of icy water, left to freeze in the open air, or subjected to insane high-altitude simulations where their lungs suffered great damage and their bodies convulsed from rapid decompression. All of this was done to see how long German pilots might survive in the cold or thin air. Most of the prisoners didn't survive at all. Then came the revival. If the cold didn't kill them, victims were dumped into scalding baths or subjected to forced intimacy with women while they were still unconscious. There were also malaria experiments, where hundreds of Polish priests and other inmates were deliberately infected just so Nazi doctors could take notes while they died. Some were also infected with festering, pus-filled wounds, while others were simply beaten to death or worked until their bodies collapsed. When the camp was finally liberated, about a third of the prisoners were too sick to walk, and the Nazis tried to cover their tracks by burning records, blaming typhus and pneumonia, but testimonies and surviving documents exposed the horror. The Gulag Purge. In the heat of war, Stalin's regime conducted purges so brutal that even loyal generals were dragged out in the middle of the night and shot. If hell had a bureaucracy, it probably looked like the Soviet Gulag. On paper, it was a correctional labor system, a sort of prison workforce for the motherland. In reality, it was a massive network of punishment camps scattered across the frozen wastelands of Siberia and beyond. These camps were built on fear, forced labor, and a whole lot of human suffering. From the 1930s to the early 1950s, under Stalin's iron rule, millions were swept into this system. Some were actual criminals, but a huge chunk were guilty of nothing more than telling the wrong joke or thinking a little too freely for Stalin's taste. The Gulag didn't care much about innocence. Trials were optional. Instead, they had these little troikas, which were basically kangaroo courts made up of 3 guys with too much power who'd decide your fate in minutes. Once you were tagged, you vanished. Trains would drop you in the middle of nowhere, usually some frozen wasteland where winter wasn't just cold, it was straight up petty, the kind of place where your breath would freeze before it left your mouth. The camps were surrounded by nothing but forests, ice, and the kind of cold that made escape a death sentence. Inside, it was brutal. Prisoners had to work or die trying, logging, mining, building entire cities with nothing but hand tools and desperation. Nothing was off limits, especially during the war when food ran low, and the state decided prisoners could survive on fewer calories or not at all. Some camps cut meals so harshly that prisoners dropped dead by the hundreds each month. Disease, starvation, and cold were constant, and sanitation was a joke. If you worked hard enough, you might earn less time, more food, or even a mattress if you were lucky. Some camps had newspapers and theater troupes. Others had machine guns on towers and mass graves in the back. Survival often depended on luck, silence, and whether your body could outlast the work. By the time Stalin died, millions had passed through the Gulag, and at least 1.5 million never made it out. Units. In Japanese-occupied Manchuria, there was Unit 7041, a military unit disguised as a research facility that turned science into a tool for torture. Built in 1936 and run by General Shiro Ishii, this place was all about perfecting biological warfare, and it did so by turning thousands of living, breathing humans into lab rats. And get this, calling them humans would have upset the staff, so they had a different name, logs, as if the people they experimented on were items on a list to be checked off daily. Behind those walls, people were infected with plague, anthrax, and typhoid. They were frozen solid to test frostbite remedies, then their limbs were smashed like blocks of ice. Some victims were pumped full of seawater to see if it could be a blood substitute, while others had their stomachs cut out and intestines rerouted while they were still alive, all without anesthesia. Pregnant women were deliberately infected, just to see if diseases would pass to their babies. And when it was time to examine the results, the same women were sliced open. Some babies were kept alive in cages for further tests. Others were preserved in jars. Vivisections were a daily affair. One doctor remembered cutting into a screaming man infected with plague and said it was just another day at the office. Another researcher confessed that he preferred stuffing rags in people's mouths before the cutting began to keep the screaming down. A few were forced to freeze to death while being filmed. After Japan surrendered, the US quietly offered immunity to many Unit 731 scientists in exchange for their biological warfare data. No trials, no accountability. Most of the world never heard a word about it, as the world powers buried the crime so deeply that many still haven't. Nazi occultism. You've probably heard that the Nazis had a thing for the occult. At first, it sounds like some made-up Hollywood propaganda. But here's the thing, it wasn't all fiction. By the time Hitler was giving intense speeches and setting the world on fire, people already felt like something wasn't quite right. And to be fair, the Nazi leadership didn't do much to ease suspicions. They were openly using ancient symbols and mixing mysticism straight into their fascism, like it was part of the user manual. As a result, some people believed they were obsessed with secret societies and hidden knowledge, guided by supernatural forces. A lot of this came from a belief system called Ariosophy, a mix of racial theory and mystical ideas that was floating around in Germany and Austria before the Nazis came to power. Himmler, one of Hitler's top men, really bought into it. He believed in ancient Aryan bloodlines and tried to turn the SS into a Death Eater cosplay group powered by ancient space racism. He even used runes and myths to make the group feel like it had some spiritual importance. The Nazis also searched for relics and stories about lost civilizations and ancient warriors, genuinely believing this knowledge could help them win the war. It wasn't just about military power. They wanted to believe they were part of something older, something bigger. They didn't invent these ideas, but they used them to add depth to their twisted worldview. After the war, Nazi occultism mutated into its own genre of conspiracy theory and paranormal fanfic. Writers began to suggest that Hitler wasn't just evil. He was under the influence of dark forces, had learned black magic as a child, or was following some apocalyptic prophecy. It all got a bit dramatic. Historian Nicholas Goodrick Clark confirmed that yes, there were real occult influences, but most of the more extreme claims like demonic possession were exaggerated or invented later on. Still, the stories, even now, places like Hohensyberg Castle in the Czech Republic attract curious visitors who whisper about Nazi experiments and demons in the basement. British black propaganda. Demons might not have been whispering in Hitler's ear, but the Brits definitely were, and they had better scripts. What they were doing was something sneakier, spreading black propaganda, which is fake news dressed up in enemy colors. It's when you spread misinformation while pretending it's coming from your enemy just to mess with people's heads. Unlike traditional propaganda that proudly waves its flags, black propaganda doesn't yell. It just nods along, borrows your voice, and stabs you in the back mid-sentence. By the time you realize it's a lie, the damage has already been done. Enter Sefton Delmer, the unofficial king of British black propaganda. A journalist turned wartime mischief maker, Delmer spoke German so fluently he could have passed for a Berlin native, and that's exactly what he did on air. One of his most infamous creations was the Soldetender Kalai, a fake German military radio station. On the surface, it sounded legit. Patriotic tunes, Hitler speeches, the usual, but between the songs, Delmer would drop little bombs. Rumors about officers hoarding supplies or sleeping with soldiers' wives, just enough to stir resentment. The genius part was that German soldiers had no clue it was British. Another project, Gustav Siegfried Eins, was even more aggressive, featuring a fake Nazi insider named Der Chef ranting about how corrupt Hitler's circle had become. He wasn't real, of course, but his angry, frustrated tone struck a nerve. And then there was the rumor about Shingle Street. The story went that the Germans had tried to invade Britain and got absolutely wrecked. Their bodies torched. The beach turned into a bloodbath, except none of it happened. Total fiction, tactical fiction. Still, the story spread through neutral countries, made its way into American newspapers, and boosted the idea that Britain could hold its own. That little lie may have helped tip the scales toward U.S. support. Operation Paperclip, right at the messy end of World War II, as Germany's empire crumbled, the United States made a smooth move called Operation Paperclip, a secret brain-snatching mission to vacuum up Nazi scientists before the Soviets could get them. The goal was to win the next big war, the Cold War, using minds once devoted to Hitler's cause. These lab nerds were deeply entangled in Nazi crimes. Take Wernher von Braun, the guy who later became a NASA bigwig. He once built rockets for Hitler that were tested with slave labor and rained down on civilians. But instead of facing judgment, he and over 1,600 others were whisked away to cozy jobs in America, some even getting to bring their families along. The US wanted their rocketry secrets. But these Nazi brains also had insights into chemical weapons, biological experiments, and in some cases, torture-based medical research. So, how did they know who to target? Well, fragments of the infamous Osenberg list, basically a Nazi VIP scientist directory, were found stuffed in a toilet at Bonn University. That list was passed to Allied intelligence and became the blueprint for who got scooped up. Operation Paperclip helped launch the US into the space age. Sure, but it also blurred every moral line in existence and made heroes of war criminals, turned Cold War assets. While Americans cheered moon landings, they did so thanks to the minds behind some of history's darkest horrors. Tier 3. Okay, this is getting really dark. Japanese cannibalism. By the time the war was grinding into its later years, things went from desperate to downright unthinkable. On a lonely island in the Pacific called Savicheva, in September 1944, 9 American pilots were shot down. 8 were captured by Japanese troops. Only one made it out alive, George H.W. Bush. Yeah, that George Bush. He went on to become the 41st president of the U.S., while the others who weren't as lucky became victims of one of the most horrifying war crimes ever committed. The captured airmen were tortured, beaten, and then executed. But it didn't stop there. Japanese officers, under the command of Lieutenant General Yoshio Tachibana, went on to cook and eat parts of their bodies. And this wasn't the act of one rogue lunatic. It was coordinated from the top down. 4 of the airmen had their livers and thighs cut out and served up. Some sources claim it was for medical reasons, while others say it might have been part of a ritual or a cult act. But when you're slicing up prisoners and passing around body parts, the reasons kind of lose their meaning. Cannibalism wasn't entirely unheard of among starving Japanese troops on remote islands. But what made this incident stand out was the level of cold-blooded intent. These weren't desperate soldiers, they were doctors and officers casually turning prisoners into dinner. When the war ended, the truth spilled out during trials. Tachibana and several others were hanged for murder. But oddly enough, cannibalism wasn't technically a war crime at the time, so they were prosecuted for everything except eating people. Worse, Chichijima wasn't even unique. Across the Pacific, starving Japanese troops were cutting up locals and Allied prisoners alike. In New Guinea, there were reports of some units butchering their own dead, and soldiers from one battalion were suspected of eating a villager just before surrendering. The death marches. By late 1944, the Nazi Empire was crumbling fast, but they weren't about to let go of their skeletons quietly. They couldn't leave living proof of their war crimes just hanging around. Hence the death marches. These were mass forced evacuations of concentration camp prisoners that doubled as an inhumane attempt at house cleaning. With the Red Army closing in from the east and the Allies from the west, the Nazis started dragging their prisoners on endless treks through snow, ice, and starvation, trying to hide what they'd done and squeeze out whatever labor they could before the end. They were slow, freezing, and fatal parades of death. Prisoners from places like Auschwitz and Dachau, who were little more than skin and bones, were told to walk up to 35 miles a day in the dead of winter with no food, no rest, and no shoes that fit. They marched through villages and forests, often towards train stations where they'd be crammed into cattle cars with no heat or water, only to be dumped out and marched even further. Anyone who stumbled or lagged behind was either shot on the spot or just left to die. In January 1945, the biggest of the marches began. 56,000 prisoners were shoved out of Auschwitz as the Soviets approached. Around 15,000 of them didn't make it. Some froze where they fell, others were executed for collapsing in the snow or just shoved into rivers and gunned down. The SS guards claimed they were trying to move people, but what they were really trying to do was erase evidence. Camps were burned, records destroyed, and bodies buried or left in frozen heaps. But some survivors did make it, and their stories, like that of Elie Wiesel, who wrote of dragging himself through the snow with his dying father, are the only reason we know how horrifying these marches really were. The Katyn Massacre. In the spring of 1940, while the world was distracted, the Soviet NKVD, the USSR's secret police, were quietly rounding up thousands of Polish officers, intellectuals, and public servants. Pretty much anyone the Soviets thought might one day raise a fuss about Poland being carved up, like a holiday ham between Hitler and Stalin. Many had been captured the previous autumn. At first, they thought they were being relocated, but then came the orders from Stalin himself. These 22,000 men were enemies of the state, and death was the penalty. The execution process was chillingly efficient. One by one, prisoners were marched into a soundproof room, shot in the back of the head, and their bodies dumped out a back door. Vasily Blokhin, Stalin's top killer, personally executed over 7,000 men in Kalinin, doing this every night for nearly a month while wearing a leather butcher's apron to keep the blood off his uniform. The Soviets used German pistols for the job because their own revolvers hurt the executioner's wrist after the first dozen kills. Mass graves were dug in the forests of Katyn, Kharkiv, and Mednoy. When the Nazis discovered the Katyn site in 1943, they turned it into a propaganda tool, blaming the Soviets. Stalin responded by cutting ties with the Polish government in exile, claiming the Nazis had done it, and the lie held up for nearly 50 years. The Lebensborn Program. While bombs fell and soldiers dug trenches, Heinrich Himmler had his own little side quest. Sure, he wanted territory, but he also wanted to engineer a new race that fit his twisted vision of Aryan perfection. And that's where Lebensborn came in. Officially, it was a welfare program for struggling mothers, but under the hood, it was a eugenics project, a state-sanctioned breeding program complete with pedigree checks and adoption forms. It started small in 1935 with a few maternity homes where carefully selected, racially valuable women could give birth in peace. Most were unwed, some were volunteers, others were pressured. SS officers were encouraged to father these children. The mission was to flood Germany with pure Aryan babies. If you were blonde, blue-eyed, and your family tree had no blemishes, the SS had a crib ready for your kind. But the real horror started when Germany decided it needed more than just the good stock at home. That's when Lebensborn took its mission on tour. In occupied countries like Poland and Norway, SS agents began abducting children who looked Aryan from orphanages, hospitals, and even directly from their parents. The toddlers were measured and tested like livestock. Those who passed the racial inspections were renamed, brainwashed, and shipped off to German families. Those who didn't make the cut were deported, sent to camps, or simply vanished. Estimates say tens of thousands, possibly over 200,000 children were taken this way, though exact numbers are murky because the Nazis torched the records when the Allies were coming. After the war, many of these children had no memory of who they really were. German camp brothels. As if forced labor, starvation, and mass murder weren't enough, the Nazis decided to set up makeshift brothels inside the camps themselves. Officially, they were meant to motivate prisoners to work at places like Auschwitz and Buchenwald. The brothels were called joy divisions and weren't open to just anyone. Only favored prisoners, career criminals, informants, Nazi collaborators were allowed in. Jewish prisoners were banned because Nazi racism never took a day off. Unlike the Lebensborn program where some women volunteered, the brothel women had no real choice. Many were taken from Ravensbrück, the largest women's camp, or were already imprisoned at Auschwitz. None volunteered. Many were lured with false promises of better rations and a shorter sentence. What they got instead was humiliation, trauma, and a brutal routine. The women were assigned strict schedules, matched with men, and the clients paid with coupons, while the women got nothing but trauma, disease, and the constant threat of death. There are reports that some women were tattooed with the word Feldhörer, Feldhörer, Feldhörer. Others were forcibly sterilized or subjected to brutal abortions. At one point, Himmler even used the brothels as conversion therapy, forcing gay prisoners to participate in hopes of curing them. It didn't work, of course, but it gives you a glimpse into just how warped Nazi logic really was. For decades, no one talked about these places. It took survivor memoirs in the 90s to drag this nightmare into the light. Ohrdruf. By late 1944, buried deep in the frozen guts of Nazi Germany, a new kind of hell opened up. Ohrdruf. On paper, it was just a subcamp of Buchenwald, but don't let the term subcamp fool you. It was every bit as brutal. Originally a military training ground, the site was rebranded into a death trap for thousands of forced laborers. Their mission was to build tunnels and railways for some top-secret Nazi project, rumored to be Hitler's underground command center, or even a nuclear bomb testing ground. Prisoners came in waves. Russians, Poles, Jews, Italians, Greeks. There were no beds and no toilets. Just straw crawling with lice and soaked in blood. Work shifts stretched up to 14 hours a day. If you dropped, you died. If you slowed down, you were beaten or shot. By March 1945, Ohrdruf was holding nearly 20,000 prisoners, most of whom were barely alive. Those too weak to work were sent to the Sterbellager, the death camp section. If you couldn't walk, the SS would march you to the parade ground, tell you food was coming, then shoot you, and leave your body to rot. As American forces closed in, the SS scrambled to erase the evidence, digging up mass graves and burning bodies on railway tracks. But it was too late. On April 4, 1945, the 4th Armored Division rolled in and walked straight into a nightmare. What they found was so horrifying that Generals Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley came to see it with their own eyes. Bodies were stacked like firewood dusted in lime. Half-dead survivors could barely speak, so they mimed the torture they'd been through. Even hardened American soldiers broke down. Some cried, others just threw up. Ohrdruf was the first Nazi camp the U.S. liberated, and the horror was so undeniable that Eisenhower personally made sure journalists and politicians came to see it, just so nobody could ever say it didn't happen. Tier 4. The truly bizarre and obscure, the V-1 flying bomb. Just as the Allies were catching their breath after D-Day, the sky started buzzing. Literally. The Germans had cooked up a new nightmare. The V-1 flying bomb, better known as the buzz bomb, Doodlebug, or if you're feeling dramatic, Hellhound. It was the world's first cruise missile, and it sounded like a giant mosquito from hell. People in London learned fast. If you heard the buzz, you were still safe. The second it stopped, you had maybe 10 seconds to pray. At first, the V-1s weren't dropped from planes. They were launched from hidden ramps along the French and Dutch coasts, flung into the sky by a chemical steam catapult, like something from a cartoon. Except this cartoon ended with buildings blown to rubble. They weren't precise or sleek, but they were cheap, fast to build, and terrifying. Between June 1944 and March 1945, more than 10,000 V-1s were fired, mostly at London and later Belgium. Hospitals, homes, and schools were all fair game. Survivors said the silence that came after a V-1 drop was worse than the sound. To make sure nobody could get their hands on a dud, the Germans added a third fuse to blow the whole thing up if it didn't hit anything. Battle of Tarawa. Tarawa was supposed to be a quick pit stop on the road to Tokyo. The Americans thought they had it all mapped out. Firepower, numbers, and a solid plan. What they didn't count on were the Japanese troops who'd been ordered to fight to the last man at dawn on November 20th, 1943. U.S. Navy battleships began pounding Dachau, the main island. The idea was to blast the island so hard that nothing was left to shoot back. And while the shelling did kill a lot of defenders, it didn't kill nearly enough. The Japanese had spent months digging deep into reinforced bunkers and concrete pillboxes. When the Marines landed, those positions were still very much intact and fully manned. Then nature betrayed them. The tide stayed too low, forcing hundreds of Marines to jump into waist-deep water and wade nearly 500 yards across open reef, all under relentless machine gun fire. It was a massacre before they even hit the sand. Survivors crouched behind a flimsy log seawall, pinned down and bleeding out under the blazing sun. One Marine said it was like walking into a buzzsaw. Whole squads just disappeared. Inch by bloody inch, the Marines clawed their way forward, clearing bunkers with bayonets and trenches with grenades. By the end of day 3, it was over. Tarawa was taken, but at a horrifying cost. Nearly 6,400 people died fighting over a speck of coral just 2 miles long. Operation Flintlock. After the bloodbath at Tarawa, the US military decided it was time to work smarter, not harder. Charging headfirst into island fortresses clearly wasn't ideal, especially when you could just sneak past the worst of it. That mindset gave birth to Operation Flintlock, a January 1944 assault on the Marshall Islands. By now, the Japanese knew what was coming, but instead of loading up the islands America actually wanted, they scattered their troops across outer atolls. It was a bold strategy, but it didn't exactly work out. You see, American codebreakers had been eavesdropping for months and knew exactly where to strike. The real nightmare started at Kwajalein, where more than 8,000 Japanese troops waited behind bunkers and buried spider holes. These were not guys looking to surrender, they were told to fight to the last man, and they took that job seriously. When the Americans landed, the ground exploded, but some hidden bunkers survived even after days of naval and air bombardments. By the time it was over, only a handful of Japanese defenders were still breathing, too injured to keep fighting. Up next was Anahuatok, and if you thought Kwajalein was hard, this one was a whole new level. As the war raged on, the beach turned blood red. Out of 4,000 defenders, barely 100 were captured alive. The rest were vaporized, burned, or shredded. By the end of February, the US had secured the Marshalls, and with them, a launching pad to bomb Tokyo into dust. The Diary of Tanya Savicheva. During the siege of Leningrad, when food was scarcer than hope, an 11-year-old girl named Tanya Savicheva quietly wrote herself into history. Her diary was a death toll, as her family dropped off one by one. The siege had turned Leningrad into a starvation camp, and the Savichevs, like thousands of others, had no choice but to stay. Then the dying began. It started with Gina, her oldest sister, who had been working double shifts at a munitions plant on 250 grams of bread a day. Her body just gave out. Then Grandma went next. Then her brother Leoka. Then Uncle Vasya and Uncle Leosha. Then Mama. Each death was scribbled down in Tanya's notebook like a cold, miserable tally. The final 3 pages had no name, just the words, "The Savichevs are dead. Everyone is dead. Only Tanya is left." But even that wasn't true for long. After being rescued and sent to an orphanage, Tanya did not recover. The hunger and tuberculosis had done too much damage. She died in 1944, at 14 years old, and her diary was later presented at the Nuremberg trials as evidence of Nazi cruelty. The Cowra Breakout. By 1944, World War II had reached deep into the Australian outback, where a sleepy town called Cowra became the setting for one of the bloodiest prison escapes in modern history. Over 1,000 Japanese POWs were held there, and tensions were simmering. On the night of August 5, 1944, word leaked that the Japanese prisoners were being shipped to another camp. To many, this was a dishonor worse than capture, so they made a choice, not to live with the shame, but to die trying to reclaim their dignity. What came next was total chaos. At 2 a.m., a bugle blasted, a warning shout echoed, and then came the screaming, "Banzai!" Hundreds of prisoners surged forward, throwing blankets over barbed wire and charging guards with handmade weapons like clubs and sharpened wires. Perhaps the most terrifying part is that the Japanese prisoners were not looking to win, just to die fighting. The guards fired into the darkness, mowing down rows of escapees. 2 Australian soldiers, Hardy and Jones, manned a machine gun until they were overwhelmed. Before dying, Hardy yanked the bolt out of the gun so the prisoners couldn't turn it on his comrades. Some prisoners who escaped ran straight into the bush, only to slit their own throats rather than be recaptured. By the end, 231 Japanese were dead, along with 4 Australians. Every escapee was recaptured within 10 days. The fall of Bataan and the Death March. The fall of Bataan didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, brutal collapse. For 3 months, American and Filipino soldiers clung to the Bataan Peninsula, starving, sick, and outgunned. They were battling hallucinations from hunger and the realization that no one was coming to save them. On April 3, 1942, the Japanese launched their final push, blasting the line with artillery and wave after wave of bombers. Filipino divisions cracked first, not because they were cowards, but because they had nothing left. By April 9, the writing was on the wall. General Edward King surrendered, hoping to save lives. He did, but he also handed 75,000 troops over to what would become one of the worst war crimes of the 20th century, the Bataan Death March. When the dust settled, surviving troops were told to march. Over 70,000 starving, wounded, and exhausted soldiers were forced to walk 65 miles with little food and almost no water. The Japanese had expected maybe 25,000 prisoners. They got more than double that, and their solution was to move them like cattle, except march is way too soft a word. This was slow-motion slaughter. If a prisoner stumbled, they were shot, stabbed, or beheaded where they fell. Some were tied up and left under the scorching sun and the sun treatment to die of dehydration. Guards even started ripping out gold filings from prisoners' teeth. When the march finally ended at the train station, things got worse. The men were crammed into metal boxcars in 1110-degree heat with no windows, air, or toilets. By the time the survivors arrived at Camp O'Donnell, an estimated 10,000 of their comrades were dead. And even at the camp, the dying didn't stop. Tier 5, the deepest, weirdest, and most horrifying level, trained anti-tank dogs. While America was landing in North Africa and Germany was chewing through the Eastern Front, the Soviets were busy strapping bombs to dogs. Not metaphorically, literally, believe it or not. It started as a noble idea. Canine commandos delivering meds and rescuing soldiers. Then it got much, much darker. As the Nazis pushed east in 1941, the Soviets needed anything that could stop their tanks, so they turned man's best friend into a 4-legged suicide bomber. The original plan was a tad kinder. The dogs would run up to enemy tanks, drop off a bomb, and scurry back to safety. But that was too complicated. Some dogs froze, others ran the wrong way, and a few came sprinting back to their handlers with live bombs still strapped on. So, the Soviets ditched the return trip. Instead, they rigged the dogs with bomb vests and a one-way mission: dive under a tank, hit the chassis, and explode on contact. The training was cruel. The dogs were starved and taught to associate food with crawling under tanks. But there was one huge problem. They trained the dogs on Soviet diesel tanks. German tanks used gasoline. Guess which tank smelled right in battle? Yeah, the dogs ran under friendly tanks, or worse, panicked and ran home, detonating inside Soviet trenches. Despite claims that hundreds of tanks were destroyed, historians think the real number was closer to a dozen. A dozen tanks, thousands of dead dogs, and an ethical nightmare that smells like gasoline and gunpowder. By 1942, the Soviets pulled the plug. Navajo code talkers. By the time American boots hit the sands of the Pacific, the war had turned into a brutal test of who could outwit the other. When machines couldn't keep up, the military turned to something no algorithm could crack: the Navajo language. Navajo was a linguistic fortress. It wasn't written, had layers of complex grammar, and was so unique that even expert linguists were left scratching their heads. Enter Philip Johnston, a WWII vet who'd grown up on a Navajo reservation and came up with the idea to enlist Navajo speakers to create an uncrackable military code. The Marines recruited 29 Navajo men and handed them a job no one had done before: build an entirely new code using a language that was never designed for war. Some terms were clever substitutions. Shark meant destroyer, ironfish meant submarine. Others had to be invented from scratch, as there were no Navajo words for tanks or grenades. It worked. While cryptographers hunched over bulky machines, these guys were firing off perfectly coded messages in seconds. But here's where it gets dark. The code was so vital that some code talkers were assigned Marine escorts, not just to protect them from the enemy, but from their own side, as they were sometimes mistaken for Japanese soldiers. And if capture seemed likely, the bodyguards had orders to kill them. That's how secret this was. At Iwo Jima, 6 Navajo code talkers relayed over 800 flawless messages, and a Marine major later said they wouldn't have taken the island without them. The code was never cracked, and most of the men who carried it weren't even recognized for decades. The Japanese occupation of Kiska. When people think of WWII, they don't usually imagine a ghost island wrapped in fog, filled with abandoned guns and frozen corpses. But that's exactly what Kiska became. It started in June 1942 when Japanese troops stormed ashore to take this remote patch of land in Alaska's Aleutian chain. The only Americans there were a 12-man weather station crew and one very unlucky dog named Explosion. The Japanese hit fast, killing 2 men and capturing the rest. One guy, William House, managed to escape into the wilderness and survived for 50 brutal days eating moss, plants, and bugs, before finally surrendering at 80 pounds. Kiska and nearby Attu were turned into icy fortresses, but the real terror didn't come until the Americans started trying to take them back. Frequent air raids hammered Kiska, and American warships circled like sharks. Eventually, in July 1943, the Japanese pulled off a wild escape. Under the cover of thick fog, a convoy slipped in and plucked 5,000 soldiers off the island right under America's nose. The Allies didn't even realize they were gone. When US and Canadian forces finally landed in August, they expected a fight. What they got was silence, and then chaos. In the fog, soldiers shot each other by mistake, while mines and booby traps did their fair share of killing. Even without a single Japanese soldier left, Kiska still killed over 100 men. Operation Mincemeat. Just when you think war can't get any weirder, the British decide to win a battle using a corpse. In 1943, British intelligence cooked up a bizarre plan called Operation Mincemeat. The goal was to trick the Nazis into thinking the Allies would invade Greece, not Sicily. They would dress up a dead man, dump him off the coast of Spain, and hope the Germans fell for the paperwork in his pocket. The body they used belonged to Glinder Michael, a poor Welsh drifter who died after eating rat poison. British spies thought he was perfect for the mission because he was underweight and looked like he hadn't eaten well in weeks. They refrigerated the body, just cold enough to delay rot but not so cold it gave away the scam. The next step was to build him a new identity, Major William Martin. He had a girlfriend named Pam, played by an MI5 secretary, and British intelligence put love letters in his pockets, along with a theater ticket stub, bank overdraft notices, and even a receipt for an engagement ring. The attention to detail was insane. They even tested which inks could survive seawater. On April 30, 1943, the body was packed in dry ice, driven to a submarine, and dumped off the coast of Huelva, Spain. The fisherman who found him had no clue the soggy corpse in his net was part of an international gaslighting attempt aimed at Hitler. And it worked. Steiner's counterattack. In the final days of WWII, while Berlin was being swallowed by Soviet tanks, Hitler reached into his bag of delusions one last time and pulled out Army Detachment Steiner. Sounds impressive, right? In reality, the so-called army was a ragtag collection of battle-worn soldiers, Hitler Youth, and naval personnel with next to no infantry training. Their tanks were ancient captured French vehicles from 1940 that were hopelessly outdated. Still, Hitler insisted they'd somehow launch a counterattack and drive back the Soviet forces. Steiner, a high-ranking SS officer, took one look at his troops and realized it was hopeless. They had no air support, no artillery, and barely any functioning weapons. So he phoned his superior and basically said, "Yeah, this is insane. We're not doing it." On April 22, the dam finally broke. In a room full of stunned generals, Hitler snapped. He had a full meltdown and admitted for the first time out loud that the war was lost, blaming the generals, the army, and even fate itself. In the end, Detachment Steiner never even made it to battle. So, how did it all end? By 1945, the Axis powers were falling apart. Hitler was hiding in a bunker, the Allies were closing in, and Japan refused to back down until the US dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Germany surrendered in May, Japan in August, and World War II was finally over. But over didn't mean neat and tidy. Europe was in ruins. Millions were dead or displaced. And the world had just gotten its first taste of nuclear warfare. The Nazis were gone, but the trauma stuck around. New superpowers rose, old ones crumbled, and the Cold War slid right into the spotlight like it had been waiting backstage the whole time. So yeah, World War II ended, but the fallout, that's a whole other iceberg.